Welcome to another edition of Stand on Guard. I'm very happy to welcome back my special guest, Neil Oliver. And when we come back, we're going to be discussing how censorship is taking over not only Canada now, but Scotland.
So we are in a very precarious position in this country. We need political change, but we also need the resolve to resist.
Yes, please ring the bell, give us a thumbs up, like the station if you can, and we appreciate your support. And the more you support stations like this and Neil's, you are supporting the fight against censorship around the world. And it's not just in North America, it's in Europe, very, very definitely. So Neil, it's like there's eruptions around the world now, eruptions of censorship. And I had no idea there was so much hate in Scotland, of all places. And I read about this bill ominously entitled the Hate Crime and Public Order Act. And to me, it's shocking that these things are occurring where we least expect them. First of all, Ireland almost votes to eradicate the traditional family. This is a traditional Catholic country. You wouldn't think people would even be thinking that. And Scotland, how long has Scotland been obsessed with censorship and hate speech? I mean, I found it shocking.
Yeah, I mean, you say that. It's good to see you. It's good to see you, David. Always.
Thank you.
Ireland returned a resounding, I think it was 74% no to the changes that were proposed to the Constitution. So that's a positive. That's that 74% common sense, where they said they didn't want ideas about the family and marriage and whatever interfered with or compromised. So that's a positive thing. And in Scotland, the hate crime legislation that has come into play since April Fool's Day, how opposite is that? Consciously or unconsciously, that legislation opened up on April Fool's Day. This very idea that we should criminalize this nebulous, amorphous notion of stirring up hatred it's absolute nonsense, and it's not just people like me saying that. It's come from the police, it's come from the judiciary, it's come from people who at least have studied and been qualified in the legal profession, saying that you can't have language so imprecise in relation to this kind of thinking. You can't do this. You can't just invite the populace to make allegations that something or other has stirred up hatred. So I think I try more and more all the time, David. I try to be positive, and I think that you can see it in Ireland, as you mentioned, and you can see it in the response that the hate crime legislation has had in Scotland, from the highest to the lowest. You can see it, that people can understand it for what it is, and whether they're saying it or not, whether they're articulating it in so many words, people can understand it, intuit it, internalize it, understand it, and say it. That what we're seeing here is just an attempt to silence conversation. It's an attempt to censor anyone with the temerity, in inverted commas, to dissent, to say, I will not take this. And so actually, in a roundabout way, I see the coming into being of legislation like this as yet more another step forward in getting us to the point where we can successfully push back against this nonsense. It's nonsense, David.
Well, certainly. I thought you encapsulated the issue quite well on your own show the other day, which I watch. I watch it every week. And I'm always fascinated with your subject matter and the way you approach these issues. But if I can I'm just going to play this brief clip from your last show, because I think it really encapsulates the issue well.
laws that I speak of in Scotland are the ones that seriously, they dangle the threat of up to 7 years in jail over the heads of anyone judged to have stirred up hatred against a protected group. And I'm using the language there of the new legislation. The protected groups in question are designated in the main on the grounds of race, sexuality, and religion. Let's just say, for example, men who say they are women are specifically protected from hate in the new legislation, while actual women are not. Advocates of free speech, myself among them, I've said for years that the new laws are too vague, too open to interpretation, too vulnerable to abuse by bad actors, ever to function as good law.
Yeah, I thought that really encapsulated the issue well, because I don't understand how the first minister is it Humza or Humza Yousaf, the first minister of Scotland. Is he like a virtual leader there now? Because I recall Scotland voted against independence, but yet they're acting like they can do whatever they want, that they have no legal bounds. They can institute laws like this. So can this first minister of Scotland get away with this? Is he not subject to anything from the United Kingdom in terms of legislation or law?
Humza Yousaf, God love him. Yeah, it's worth pointing out that he wasn't elected by the people of Scotland. At the time of the last election, there was a different leader for the Scottish National Party. So in that same mysterious way in which Rishi Sunak has become the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, without being in any way elected in that sense by the people, so too has Humza Yousaf been put in place by his own party, the Scottish National Party. He was not the leader of the Scottish National Party when at the time of the last election for the political parties. So it's right and opposite that you raise that point. In terms of the devolution settlement, there are, it's not worth us getting into the time-consuming process of explaining to the audience, if they don't know it, how devolution works in the United Kingdom, or how it has worked or not worked. All I will say is that I think that for Scotland, which is the country in which I live, and the country in which I've lived most of my life, I think the devolution project has been an abject failure. I voted against devolution at the time when we were invited to have an opinion about whether or not Scotland should have a devolved administration. I've always been more in favour of a united kingdom. So as what you're alluding to there, I think devolution has been a mistake, has been a failure for Scotland. I think what we're looking at is it's just a failure. It's a failure across the board, and when it's manifest in something like the hate crime legislation, I think we see it. But then I don't think it particularly matters, in a sense, that what's happening in Scotland, or that people should get the sense that it's only happening in Scotland. I think that this kind of legislation, you've got it in Canada, other iterations of it are happening elsewhere in the world, and I think that small countries with small population, well, Canada is not a small country, it's a huge country with a small population, but I think countries with small populations are being used as petri dishes, we're being used as lab rats, to bring in legislation that can then be rolled out across the world. And so all of the iniquities and all of the failings that are made manifest in the hate crime laws in Scotland, you've got similar things happening in Canada, and I think we're just going to see that rolled out around the world.
Well, I think this USAF is another acolyte of globalism, of the World Economic Forum. I haven't seen a lot of that to confirm it, but he acts exactly like another acolyte of the WEF and globalists, namely Justin Trudeau, who, of course, Klaus Schwab has held up as a beacon of hope for the future. And another example of how the WEF and globalists have, as Klaus Schwab says, inserted themselves into foreign cabinets. Now, this is Schwab talking, not me. But it strikes me as passing strange that Yousaf, who comes from a good Muslim family, and his parents were from Pakistan, emigrated to Scotland, and he doesn't seem to exemplify or reflect any Muslim beliefs. Here he is out there defending the worst aspects of gender ideology and the whole LGBTQ agenda, ideas and notions that are not supported by most Muslims, whether in Canada or Great Britain or anywhere in the world. I work with Muslims all the time to stop gender ideology in Canada because most of them are very opposed to Justin Trudeau and his position on these issues. So once again, we have a Muslim politician enacting policies that are contrary, anathema, to his own religious base. And do you think there's something going on here?
Well, I think they're, what you have are politicians that are without principle. They're completely hollow. I talk about these people like Hamza Yusuf all the time, and Rishi Sunak, and Keir Starmer, and the rest of them, Biden, Emmanuel Macron, all of these people. They're completely hollow. They're not coming from places of. They're not real people. They don't speak from the heart. They don't tell us what they actually think. They're just avatars and mouthpieces for ideologies. So the fact that you have in Scotland Hamza Yusuf, who is of Pakistani descent, and he is a Muslim, I don't think it really matters, because that's not what these people are not. These people are just channels by which a different ideology is getting out to the public. And so, like I know Muslim people, I know Christian people, I know people of all faiths, and they don't speak like those people do. It's confusing. It's confusing to see them and understand them as Muslim, as Christian, as Jewish. It's neither here nor there, because they're just conduits by which an ideology is being pushed out to the people. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that what you're hearing coming out of Hamza Yusuf's mouth doesn't meet with what you or I might understand from Islam is neither here nor there, because that's not what they're there to do. That is the fundamental problem. We are not hearing from world leaders who actually think what they say, actually say what they think. They're just pushing out a message. And so the fact that you listen to Hamza Yusuf say what he does, and as I do, that it doesn't actually match up with Islam, it's neither here nor there. That's not what they're there to do. They're just there to push an agenda.
Yes. Well, I think you're completely correct about that. They're amoral people. They have no principles. They really serve no religion. I don't even know if they serve a God, as we understand God, at least. And it's concerning, because people like this with no principles, I think, are prepared to take our freedom away without even thinking twice about it. And since we last talked on this broadcast, of course, Canada has introduced the Online Harms Act, which I think is probably going to be the template for the world in terms of taking free speech away. And in this law in Canada, we have people potentially going to prison for life for being guilty of something called hate speech or hateful communication. There's various words for it. But we don't even put murderers in jail for life anymore, but we're prepared to put people in jail for life for saying something that is adjudicated by another government body that Trudeau is creating in this legislation that is deemed to be hate speech. And of course, it's very, very ominous. There's also huge fines that can be leveled against people who have been judged guilty of saying something hateful. But what's the most worrisome about this legislation? And I talk to Americans all the time who say, you've got to be kidding. This is like a parody of Justin Trudeau. This can't be true. But it is. And what Trudeau has put in this legislation is a thought crime portion that will put people under house arrest because the neighbor down the street judges them to be potentially guilty of thinking the wrong thing, and then they might actually say something about it. And it's incomprehensible that a democratic country would even think about that. And it is like a parody of 1984. And you think this is a bad joke, but it's actually in the legislation. And that, to me, indicates how far Western democracies have gone to become exactly like George Orwell predicted the world was going to get. It's like they're going and reading the script and saying, how else can we make our country more totalitarian and less desirous of people having the freedom to speak their minds, which of course has been the hallmark of Western civilization for 1,000 years. And it's supposed to be the foundation of democracies like Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, and others. But we're losing that. And does it worry you that you think that could also come to the UK, where we have people are put under house arrest for thought crimes?
Don't you think, though? Don't you think that it comes down to just an anti-human feeling? I have my increasingly deep suspicion that a lot of this is motivated by the thinking of people who don't like people, you know, who are just suspicious of the physical, emotional, natural reality of people. You know, there's something strangely almost robotic. We worry all the time about artificial intelligence and machines and robot intelligence, you know, taking over from us. But I think what we're seeing here is an early warning of what that might be like. If you don't like what people are, if you don't like the fact that you encounter people all the time that see the world a different way, that have different points of view, that express themselves differently. If you find yourself in a position of power where you can stop people, you can seek to stop people saying and doing the things that they naturally want to do because they're human beings. Mm-hmm. You know, this is where we're going. There's a kind of a self-selecting narrow elite of people who don't like people. I went to university in the 80s and you know, I shared flats with people and I went to the pub with people, and a large part of what I enjoyed was knowing that I was going to encounter in a sort of a wider group of people those that I knew I would disagree with. I actively looked forward to being in their company, around a table, pints of beer on the table, you know, glasses of wine, getting into conversations and knowing that I would disagree with them. And you'd have a good old argy-bargy, and then the whole thing would break up and you'd go your separate ways, and you'd meet again in another couple of weeks, and you would do it all again. And for me, that's the joy. That's the joy of interacting with people, and I didn't hold it against the people with whom I disagreed. I think now that we're increasingly finding ourselves in the grip of that narrow group of people who would rather that none of that disagreement and discussion and debate was happening. Mm-hmm. They just want to hear everyone say, and they want to think and be persuaded that everyone thinks the way that they do. And it's existential. It's an existential crisis. And that's what's underpinning all this bit about coming up with a term of words like stirring up hatred. It's absolute nonsense. That's just a way, that's just deliberately opening a doorway for those people who are anti-human and don't like the way that people are and don't like the way that people think, to have control over the way in which people express themselves quite naturally, and how they think and how they do the things that they do. And I think we're at a point that you and I, I think that you and I are, we're on the same wavelength. People like us, have to realize that we've been nudged to the tip of a precipice. And if we don't hold back, if we don't prevent ourselves and others like us from being pushed over the edge into that precipice, we're going to be a world where you just get handed a laminated bit of paper that says, these are the things that you can say today. These are the things that you can think today. And if you say anything different or think anything different, there will be consequences. And
I had the same experience at university. I had friends that I used to join for beers after class, and we would talk about politics, and they'd be Marxists. I had professors I used to hang out with who were far left, but they really believed in discourse, in conversation, in debate. And they didn't think if you disagreed with them, that they should have the right to censor you, to put a gag over your mouth. That half of the joy of education was in the discourse, the discussion, the exchange of ideas, which of course the left, or whatever they are anymore, they're a totalitarian, they're far left or they're far right, they're authoritarian, they're totalitarian, they're against free speech, they're against basic liberty, but they don't want anybody to disagree with them. And if you do, it's the gag. And that to me, is the reason why I think go ahead.
Here in the UK, your audience, I'm sure, they must have run across George Galloway, who's a socialist, old Labour from the past politician. He's recently been re-elected at a by-election. He's now the MP for Rochdale, and he comes from a time that I remember. And God forgive me, I remember, at the time in the 80s and 90s, whatever, dismissing or in my head loudly disagreeing with George Galloway. And I don't mean forgive me for that, but when I say, forgive me for taking for granted the atmosphere in which I could feel free to do that. And he was also, at the same time, he was contemporary with people like Tony Benn, who was another Labour MP of the period. And the great joy, as I look back on it with the 2020 vision of hindsight, is how articulate men like Tony Benn were, and George Galloway and others besides. And I look back and remember that while I didn't think what they thought and that I disagreed with what they were saying, at the same time I was able to appreciate how eloquent they were, and how able they were, and how quick-witted they were in debate, and how they could respond and take part in a conversation in the House of Commons, and whatever else. And looking back on it, it was a joy to behold how they were able to do that. And as you're saying, and as I was saying, I used to look forward to, and I didn't even realize why I was doing it. I used to look forward to knowing that I was going to be in the company on a Friday night in the pub with people that were a mix of those with whom I agreed and those with whom I absolutely knew I was going to have a right old verbal fight. I enjoyed that.
Yeah.
I used to phone somebody and they say, who's going to be there tonight? And they would say so-and-so. And I'd be like, oh, great. Because I would know that I was going to have a right old set to, but it wouldn't mean anything in terms of, hate crime and getting sent to jail for saying it. I was just going to have the real sort of pleasure of engaging in an argument and a conversation and a debate, at the end of which we part company, and then in a week's time or 2 weeks' time, we would meet again and we would do pretty much the same thing again. And that bubbling, fizzing, intellectually inspiring atmosphere is just being made into something flat and stale. And that cannot be to the, inverted commas, greater good.
No. Well, I think that's why in Canada, Margaret Atwood, a noted author, but also someone who was probably voting Liberal most of her life, or NDP perhaps. I don't know what her personal voting choices were, but she was certainly on the left for most of her writing career. And although I had great respect for her work, I didn't always agree with Margaret Atwood. But I do agree with Margaret Atwood today, because she's coming out vociferously against the Online Harms Act, because she says it's going to steal our free speech away and it's going to prevent me from writing what I want. And hurrah for Margaret Atwood, because I think a lot of people I would refer to as the older style liberals, the ones who still believe in free speech, like the ones that you used to talk to at university and I used to talk to, like the teachers I grew up with, who came of age during the 1960s, might have been further left than I were in most issues, but they believed in free speech, and they would allow me to speak my mind and to disagree with them without giving me an F for doing that. And of course, in the UK, we have JK Rowling, who, once again, I'm not a huge fan of the Harry Potter books, but I'm a huge fan right now of JK Rowling for standing up for free speech and saying, this is utter rubbish to say all you have to do is wake up one morning and say, I was a man yesterday, I'm a woman today, so I'm therefore subject to different laws. And I applaud her for doing that, for saying this, for having the guts to say, put me in jail if you think I'm violating your hate speech law. And I think the government's very, very reluctant to do that, of course, because she's very popular. But, I once again, I say, thank God that there are authors and journalists out there who are still prepared to put their careers on the line and say enough is enough with this.
Yeah, like you, I mean, I don't know. I mean, for you, I don't know what the details are of where and about what you disagree with JK Rowling for. I don't know, and it doesn't matter. But I just know that I've been aware of her for the last 20 odd years, and my kids, the impact of her fiction on my kids' lives has been huge. And we've had the soundtrack, the background music of the Harry Potter thinking fiction stories and all in our house for forever. And I hugely thank her for the entertainment that she's provided my children with. But I do know over the years that I don't agree with her politically about. I certainly don't agree with her about everything, and she's got stances politically over the last 20 years that I disagreed with enormously. However, what she's saying about trans, I completely agree with. Well, let me tweet that. I don't know. I mean, there'll be nuances within what she's saying that I maybe don't agree with, but broadly speaking, I agree with her saying that you can't undo biology. Leave it there. You can't do that. But more than the fact that I agree with her, because it's easy to agree with someone. As soon as someone says something that you agree with, you like them a little bit more than you did before. But the point is, I absolutely support her right to say what she says, and I absolutely agree with her absolute stubborn, because she doesn't need to do what she does. She's got whatever. She's got wealth beyond the dreams of avarice, and she could kind of disappear into that nether kingdom where the uber rich can live if they want to, without the likes of us ever seeing them. But she doesn't do that. She's like a dog with a bone, and I hugely admire her determination, to keep on going and gnawing away at that bone. But she's a very good example, because I don't think that if JK Rowling and I ever met in a room or met in a pub, I don't think we'd get on. And that's what makes her a very good example for me, because I don't need to think that I would get on with her. It's not important. I just absolutely doff my metaphorical cap to her determination to say what she thinks. I do agree with it, or I agree with bits of it, maybe the majority of it. But I just think fair play, because David, because one of the big revelations for me over the last number of years, there were so many people who had profile, who had what we now call platforms, but by which we just mean that they were famous enough that if they said something, the media would pick it up and put it out there. That there were so many people that when things started to go wrong around lockdown, around the medical interventions, around so many things, that I thought that those with a loudhailer enough that we would hear them if they said it would say something, and instead there was a deafening silence. And so it's been revelatory to me, people that I not necessarily admired, but I thought they were useful, maverick, single-minded, independent voices. But actually, when there was an opportunity to speak up and speak out about something that really, really mattered, not just their businesses, not just whatever it was they were famous for, they just kept their mouths shut so that they could, keep counting the money coming in. And I now despise those people, but there are a few noble exceptions. And JK Rowling, who could just have disappeared, she could just have kept herself quiet and, I don't know, done whatever you do on with your private yacht and whatever if you're a multi-billionaire. But she hasn't. She has stayed out there saying what she thinks, and she's been prepared to take the brickbats that come with it. So I doff my cap to that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Since the passage of this Hate Crime Public Order Act, there have been more complaints. And yes, there are morons out there actually complaining about hate speech as soon as this law became law. But there's more people complaining about USAF than there are about JK Rowling, because he made a speech, I'm sure you're aware of this, in 2020, where he said there's just far too many white people out there in positions of authority, and I feel intimidated by this. Well, I don't think people like you and I, as white male men, or white males, were included in that protected group, one of the protected groups. So I'm not sure we've had any recourse to feeling hated or threatened by USAF's words. But isn't this gross hypocrisy? Here's this guy going on about all this hatred in Scotland, and he's the one who seems to be responsible for trying to drive a wedge between white people and the rest of Scottish society. I just find this hypocrisy to be incredible.
Oh yes, I mean that speech at the time. I don't know. You've time stamped when that speech was. I don't know when he said it. It was a couple of years ago now. Whatever. But it was absolutely extraordinary that anyone would say such things. Would seem to be so blind about reality. He would, like you say, he was saying that, I mean, Scotland's a 96% white country. And he was saying how unforgivable it was that the chief of police here and the leader of the council there and the boss of the judiciary and whatever was white in a country that's 96% white, and and archaeologically and historically and whatever has been since the Ice Age. It was unbelievably, because you think, well, if I went to China, if I went to Beijing, and I moved out of from the capital city into the hinterland, I would expect that most of the people there would be Chinese people.
Yes.
Or if I went to a sub-Saharan African country and I went to a capital city, which might be a bit metropolitan, it might be a lot of people from. If I went out into the wider hinterland, I would just instinctively expect that most of those people would be sub-Saharan African people, because that would seem to be determined by the by the nature of the place, and that Hamza Yusuf would stand up in the Scottish Parliament and say that in a country that's 96% white, that he was appalled and horrified that lots of good jobs were occupied by white people. It was deaf, dumb, and blind in a way that was. You just looked on at him saying it and thought, what? How insane is this human being to think this? Never mind to articulate it in a place where it's going to be reported. But I almost don't know. I don't know what to do with seeming stupidity, insensitivity on that level. I don't know what to do with it, having looked on at it.
Yes. Well, I'm almost hoping, if this legislation can't be defeated by more rational means and by more rational politicians, that it might die from competing lawsuits or competing accusations from one group to another, because that seems to be what's happening here. Because if Yusuf wants to accuse everybody else of being hateful, then I guess everybody else has to accuse him of being hateful. And perhaps in the process, this stupid law will be destroyed. And
you're looking on the figures were hard. I mean, I don't know. I was hearing, I'm sure you were, that within 48 hours or something of the law coming into force on April Fool's Day, the 5,000 complaints, and in advance of the legislation coming into place, Police Scotland had said that despite the fact that they can't investigate burglaries and violent crime and whatever, they were going to assiduously investigate every single, complaint. And now, so they've made themselves a hostage to fortune, and clearly that is just going to clog up the system in every conceivable way. And it was said in advance, the judiciary, the police, all sorts of commentators said that if you bring in a legislation that's as vague and as open to interpretation and as open to misuse by bad actors as this is, you're going to get the following. No sooner did it come into play than all of those predictions were made real, were made fact. And so you'd have to think that, when some of the dust begins to settle, if the dust does begin to settle, that something would have to be done to alleviate the machinery from the clogging that is unavoidable if this legislation remains in place in its present form. They're going to have to do something about it. And so it will be hoisted by, Hamza Yusuf will be hoisted by his own petard.
Yeah. Well, before we get out of here, I wanted to touch on something that's very near to your heart as it is to mine. I'm ex-military. I spent about 14 years in the Royal Canadian Air Force. I spent time in Bosnia with NATO. I used to be a huge proponent of NATO. I used to write the talking points as a public affairs officer, all about how wonderful NATO was. Well, I've ceased to think NATO has a legitimate objective, except to foment war and to create the vast possibility of a third world war. And of course, you made a wonderful program a couple of months back about how the chief of the army staff in Great Britain, General Sanders, was talking about a citizen army being ready to fight Russia. And of course, we joked about this the last time we talked, about how it was very similar to the PALS regiments in the First World War that were decimated at the Battle of the Somme. Absolutely crazy idea. And here we go again talking about it. Well, France, of course, President Emmanuel Macron has been, for the last 6 weeks, going absolutely berserk about how France wants to fight Russia now, and France wants to field an army in Ukraine. And as I said to you before the broadcast, a famous quotation from William Manchester, the historian, in his biography of Winston Churchill, The Last Lion. And for some reason, I never forgot this, when he said, talking about how bad the French armies were, the French generals were in the First World War, he said the last great French general is buried in Les Invalides, of course, speaking about Napoleon Bonaparte's tomb. And it's so true. France couldn't do anything except attack in the First World War. They were the only army that actually had a mutiny, and they had a series of mutinies in 1917 because the leadership was so bad, and they kept making the same mistakes over and over again. And the Second World War, they were routed in 6 weeks by the Germans, and basically had to be bailed out again by the Americans, the Canadians, and the Brits with D-Day, because they would have stayed occupied. And here they are talking about fielding an army. Like, I don't even think France has an army. The last army they had was routed at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954 in Vietnam. So I don't know what kind of an army France has, but is there a death wish going on now? Because you and I remember the Cold War very well. We were university students in the 80s, and there were all kinds of films at that time. You know, the Day After, for instance. There were all kinds of warnings about the nuclear clock being close to midnight. And it's actually closer right now than it was back in the 80s, or even the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. But there seems to be a death wish amongst politicians today that we need to have a war with Russia, even though that war is inevitably going to lead and to escalate to nuclear arms. And I don't understand why nuclear war was unwinnable 30 years ago, 60 years ago, but somehow it's the crackpot politicians today who think we're going to win this thing with the Russians. What's wrong with us?
My hope rests with people. And I think because of the internet, because of channels like yours, and a plethora of channels to which people have access because of the internet, my faith rests with people knowing better. You know, I don't think the mass of the French population want to go to war with Russia. And I know that the mass of the British population don't want to go to war with Russia. And I absolutely have faith that the mass of the population of Russia don't want to go to war with us. By which I mean the West. I've spoken to on air and off air with commentators and analysts who say that in Russia, the abiding sense is of confusion, disbelief. They don't understand why the Russian people are being perceived as the enemy in the West. They don't understand where this is coming from. And unfortunately and happily, I think the vast majority of people in the West, in Britain, in Canada, in the United States of America, they don't have any antipathy, any natural antipathy towards the Russian people. I don't think it comes down to people. Lots of us, for various ideological and intellectual or political reasons, have problems with governments. I've problems with the Biden administration in North America, but my heart is open to the people of the United States of America, and I harbour a great antipathy towards Justin Trudeau's government in Canada. Mm-hmm. But I harbour nothing but affection for the people of Canada, and the people of France, and the people of Germany, and likewise, I'm appalled by the behaviour of Netanyahu's Israel, but I'm nothing but open-hearted towards the people of Israel, and likewise, I've got Muslim friends, people with whom I have a deep affection and deep accord, and so I have nothing but sympathy for the people of Gaza, regardless of whatever might be the political behaviours and others of Hamas. For me, it all comes down to, I think what is being revealed by the internet, we the people, the ordinary people, can see each other, and that's the opportunity that's there for us all, French, Canadian, German, Gazan, Israeli, we the people, to see that we are all of us just people, and that we have problems with our increasingly authoritarian governments that are doing things and drafting and passing legislation as though it's on our behalf. I think the solution to this, David, will be because around the world, courtesy of the internet, for as long as the channels remain open, we can see that we have more in common with one another. East and West, North and South, we can see it. We know that we just want families. We know that we just want our children to be safe. We know that we just want our families to be looked after and educated. And I have great faith in that. I'm as bleak and gloomy as the next person when I look up, but it's politics and politicians and governments that are making the problems. And from Russia to the United States of America, from Canada to Gaza to Israel to wherever, I think people like you and me have, we know increasingly we can see each other, and we understand that we don't have natural antipathies towards one another. It's being confected and driven and choreographed by those that don't have our best interests at heart. And and as long as it may last, if we can see each other, we can find a way out of this.
Well, I think that's a incredibly optimistic, and I mean that in a very,
David, you've got to be optimistic. What's the alternative to pessimism? You've got to go with it.
No, I was going to say optimistic in the sense of I can agree with that, not overly optimistic, but I think we need that kind of optimism. And so I think that's not only optimistic, but profound in terms of what you're saying there, in terms of the internet, the social media allowing us to understand each other in a way we couldn't 100 years ago. There's no question about that. But I would expect that kind of perspicacity from you, Neil. That's what enlivens your show every week, and including not just the social media shows you do, but the Great Britain News program, which I hope to get back on with you sometime again.
Of course you will.
But it's always a pleasure to talk with you. And I tell you, one of my aspirations is that we can actually meet in person sometime, because I feel like I've developed a long distance friendship with you. I feel like you're a kindred spirit in so many ways. We think so much alike, and we fight for the same things. And I could probably just ignore all of this but what concerns me is that if I ignore all of this, there's going to be cops at my door one day arresting me for hate speech, and I'm not going down without a fight. But before I forgot, I wanted to remind people, read Neil's book, Hauntings. It is the most literate book on the market about this subject matter, and I've read a lot of them. It's an interest of mine. But this is the most literate book on hauntings, because it's not just a bunch of ghost stories. There's enough of that in there, but there's archaeology, there's history, there's anthropology, and there's incredibly interesting arguments that you make about a lot of things. And I couldn't put the book down, and I've recommended it to so many of my friends and family, who I hope I've gotten up and bought it, because I haven't lent it to anybody. So thank you so much, Neil, for being with me today. It's always a pleasure to talk with you and to hear what you have to say.
David, it's lovely. Thank you so much for all your kind words about my book. That's lovely. But I do, I suppose I'm probably by nature a glass half empty kind of guy. Mm-hmm. But my wife, Trudy, is the opposite. And we, you know, so we balance each other out. And she reminds me that, you know, there's a reason why our civilizations and our species keep on surviving. You know, we keep on getting beyond the various obstacles, and we keep on getting beyond the 20th century. That the human species survived the 20th century, to me, is quite remarkable in and of itself. And I do remember, as far as I can and for as long as I can, to have faith in the people. We get distracted by the things that we're invited to listen to, which used to be government propaganda. But the internet and social media have enabled us, the people, to listen to each other. Mm-hmm. And if the connections that we make there, if we can hold on to those connections, that is the scaffolding upon which we will build something better. So even when I'm feeling most despondent, I hold on to that. And when I have an encounter with somebody like yourself, your good self, as you say, kindred spirit, which we certainly are, and there are plenty of us. Mm-hmm. And you know, people listening to your channel, people listening to my channel, just remember that, you know, whatever you think and whatever I think, whatever David thinks, there's loads of us connected in the same way. You know, be positive. Be positive, be optimistic, even if it's not in your nature. And it's not in mine, but I've learned to do it.
Well, I think we all have to learn to do it, because these are crazy times we live in, very evil times, but I think we can overcome them if we do work together. And that's what we need to do. And that's and on that note, I guess we'll say goodbye for now. But thank you so much for joining me today, Neil. And it's always a pleasure. And believe me, we're huge fans here in this Krayden household of the work you've done over the years as an archaeologist before you became, I think, the most important pundit in the UK today. And believe me, that's something most of my viewers would agree with. They're all fans of yours. And every time we ever do anything with you, or every time I even show a clip on my show from your broadcast, I get fantastic comments from people who say, we just love Neil Oliver because he's speaking so profoundly about what's actually happening today. And this is a man worth listening to. So I believe that too.
I'll only look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Okay. Thank you so much, Neil. And we will stay in touch.